It's late at night. A woman sits alone, scrolling through her phone, her eyes locked on a message that seems to tug at her heartstrings. She knows something is wrong, but she can't put her finger on it. The words on the screen seem innocent enough, but why does she feel this sudden rush of anxiety? The man on the other side of the screen, charming and confident, doesn't seem to notice. Or does he? Emotional manipulation doesn't come with a warning. It's insidious, creeping into our lives unnoticed, often disguised as affection, care, or even love. But what if it's not? What if the affection is just a mask, a tool for control? The question is simple. Why do women, why do people, fall for emotional manipulation without even knowing it? In this documentary, we'll explore this question, diving deep into the mind of one of history's most profound philosophers. His ideas on self-deception, existential anxiety, and the complex relationship between identity and the other will serve as a map to understand how emotional manipulation functions, not just on the surface, but deep within the psychological structure of human relationships. By the end of this journey, we'll begin to see how emotional manipulation has always been with us, operating through invisible threads that bind us. It's time to pull those threads apart. The philosophy of manipulation, Slens. The Danish philosopher lived in a time of great societal upheaval, an age marked by the rise of modernity, but also by the existential crisis of the individual in a world that was no longer sure of its purpose. In his works, explored the depths of human psychology and the dangers of living a life controlled by external forces. These forces, in a sense, are the invisible puppeteers that tug at our strings every day. But what if we are the ones who have unknowingly allowed them to pull us? Understood something fundamental about the human condition. We are deeply social beings, and yet we are also terrified of being consumed by society. We crave connection, but this craving comes with a price. It's a paradox that sits at the heart of emotional manipulation. We seek validation and meaning from others, and in doing so, we lose sight of our true selves. In fact, would argue that we become lost in the very thing we sought to fill our emptiness, the other. In his concept of self-deception, suggests that we live in constant tension between who we are and who we present to the world. We wear masks, presenting only parts of ourselves that we think others will find acceptable, and in this process, we deceive not only those around us but, more tragically, ourselves. We begin to believe the false narratives we create, narratives that validate our existence but are rooted in lies. These lies are what emotional manipulators feed on. They thrive on our need to be loved, admired, and accepted, even if it means sacrificing our authenticity. Emotional manipulation works precisely because it targets our greatest vulnerability, the fear of being unloved or unseen. This concept of despair perfectly encapsulates this. In a moment of despair, when we feel disconnected from our true selves and desperately seek meaning, we are susceptible to external influences that promise to fill the void. The manipulator steps in at that moment of despair, offering love, validation, or a sense of worth, only for it to come with strings attached. The question then becomes, can we ever truly know ourselves if we are constantly living for the validation of the other? This idea of self-deception, combined with the fear of isolation, creates a fertile ground for emotional manipulation. The manipulator doesn't always use force or threats. They simply prey on our desire for connection, twisting it into a tool of control. What makes this even more dangerous is that we, the manipulated, rarely recognize the control. We've allowed ourselves to be deceived into thinking we're in control of the situation, when in fact, we are merely playing out a script written by someone else. Take, for instance, the dynamic of gaslighting, one of the most insidious forms of emotional manipulation. This is where a manipulator systematically undermines someone's perception of reality, making them question their thoughts, feelings, and even memories. It's a game of control, but one that is subtle enough to feel like a series of misunderstandings. Yet, as would argue, this manipulation feeds directly into the despair of the individual. If we cannot trust our own perceptions, what are we left with but an empty shell of ourselves? The manipulator, then, becomes the architect of that emptiness, molding us into what they desire. This concept of anxiety, that gnawing sense of dread and unease that comes with the realization that we are free to choose, but often unable to do so authentically, also plays a role here. The manipulator exploits this anxiety, offering what seems like certainty and direction. They promise to fill the void that existential freedom creates. But in truth, they offer nothing but another form of enslavement. At the heart of philosophy is the idea that we must confront the truth of who we are, our vulnerabilities, our fears, our desires, and from there, make choices that are authentic to our true selves. But emotional manipulation prevents this confrontation. It keeps us trapped in a cycle of needing validation from the outside, and as long as that need remains unmet, we remain vulnerable to manipulation. The other, the person or entity to whom we look for validation, becomes both the mirror and the manipulator. This dynamic is not limited to romantic relationships. It's everywhere: social media influencers, political leaders, advertisers. These figures use emotional manipulation to control the narrative, to make us feel that without them, we are incomplete. They offer us a version of ourselves that we believe we can never achieve on our own, and in doing so, they chain us to their narrative. Would argue that in seeking this external validation, we give up our true identity, replacing it with a version that is constructed by forces outside of our control. But there is a way out, believed that only by confronting the reality of our isolation, our anxiety, and our desires can we begin to live authentically. The answer isn't to shun relationships or society, but to engage with them on our own terms, with full awareness of our vulnerabilities and our autonomy. It's only then that we can begin to break free from the grip of emotional manipulation. In the next section, we'll explore the historical roots of emotional manipulation, showing that these dynamics are not new, but have been with us for centuries. The puppeteers may have changed, but the strings are the same. The world has always been filled with forces that seek to control us, whether they are political, religious, or personal. As we move forward, we will explore how emotional manipulation has been used as a tool throughout history, from the rulers of the past to the media of today. These forces have shaped our world, and in many ways, they continue to shape us. Section 2: The Evolution of Emotional Manipulation. A Historical Lens. The air was thick with the scent of incense as the faithful knelt in silent reverence before the altar. The priest, robed in sacred garb, raised his hand, and the congregation bowed their heads in submission, not just to the divine, but to a system that had held sway over their lives for centuries. In the midst of this, few questioned why they obeyed. The power of religion, of monarchy, and of state was more than just governance. It was the subtle art of emotional manipulation. Emotional manipulation is not a product of the modern age. It has roots that extend deep into history, woven into the very fabric of our societies. Throughout the ages, powerful institutions, religious, political, and familial, have mastered the art of manipulating human emotions to maintain control over populations. It's a tool used to influence and dominate, to shape perceptions and bend the will of the masses. From kings to clerics, rulers have understood one profound truth: controlling people's emotions is the path to power. But while emotional manipulation has been with us its methods and reach have evolved dramatically. We have witnessed the rise of modern consumerism, the birth of advertising, and the development of psychological techniques aimed at exploiting our deepest fears, desires, and insecurities. As we trace the evolution of emotional manipulation, we uncover not just a story of power, but one of the human need for connection, validation, and meaning. The historical roots of emotional manipulation in societal power structures. The earliest examples of emotional manipulation can be traced back to the formation of early human societies. When human beings gathered together in tribes and villages, the leaders of these communities quickly learned that emotional control could be more effective than physical force in maintaining order. Whether it was a chieftain in ancient tribes or a monarch in the Middle Ages, emotional manipulation was an essential tool in their arsenal. In these societies, the leaders often presented themselves as divinely ordained. Kings and emperors claimed a direct link to gods or the heavens, ensuring that their rule was not just political but sacred. This blend of political and spiritual authority created a dynamic where questioning the ruler wasn't merely an act of rebellion. It was seen as a challenge to the very structure of the universe. Emotional manipulation, then, became a mechanism by which the rulers held the hearts and minds of the people. The people's faith in their leaders, rooted in fear and awe, kept them in line, and their need for purpose and meaning was exploited. The Church, for example, has long been a powerful force in shaping the emotional lives of individuals. The promise of salvation, the threat of damnation, and the role of religious figures as intermediaries between the divine and the earthly created a fertile ground for emotional manipulation. People's deepest fears of death, of sin, and of the unknown were used as emotional levers by the Church to maintain both control and compliance. Emotional manipulation in monarchy, religion, and politics. As we move through history, the methods of emotional manipulation evolved, but the basic principles remain the same. Monarchs continued to rule under the guise of divine right, and religious institutions maintained their hold over people's emotional states by offering comfort in times of suffering. But the scale of manipulation grew. Take the case of monarchs in Europe during the Renaissance and beyond. The divine right of kings, rooted in both political power and religious authority, was the foundation upon which their reign was built. Monarchs often manipulated the emotional landscape of their kingdoms through elaborate rituals, grand ceremonies, and public displays of power that aimed to awe the people into submission. The king's presence at a royal procession, the queen's benevolent image, and the lavishness of the court were not just symbols of wealth. They were carefully crafted emotional triggers designed to reinforce the belief that the ruler's authority was divinely sanctioned. Religion, too, was manipulated to bolster political power. Think of the Spanish Inquisition or the role the Catholic Church played in the spread of Christianity throughout Europe. Both used emotional manipulation to ensure that belief was not just a matter of doctrine, but of life and death. Guilt, fear, and the promise of eternal reward or punishment were the tools through which religious authorities shaped both the spiritual and emotional worlds of their followers. The masses, fearful of damnation, were not only spiritually controlled, but emotionally bound to the decisions of their religious leaders. In the political sphere, emotional manipulation was often used to unite people under a common cause, whether that was loyalty to the nation, the fight for a certain ideology, or the protection of a political regime. The rhetoric of revolutionaries, the propaganda of kings, and the speeches of political leaders have long been designed to tug at the heartstrings of their audience. Leaders like Napoleon, Churchill, and even understood that in times of war or national crisis, people's deepest emotional vulnerabilities, fear, patriotism, loyalty, could be manipulated to garner support. The advent of advertising and psychological manipulation in the 20th century. The real transformation in emotional manipulation came in the 20th century with the rise of advertising and mass media. The power to manipulate emotions was no longer confined to the elites of society. It became a tool that could be used by corporations, governments, and media organizations to shape public opinion and behavior on a massive scale. The invention of advertising changed everything. No longer were people simply manipulated by monarchs or religious authorities. Now they were targeted by corporations eager to sell goods, ideas, and lifestyles. Advertising agencies quickly realized that by appealing to emotions, specifically to feelings of inadequacy, desire, and fear, they could influence consumer behavior in ways previously unimaginable. Take the iconic example of the cigarette advertisements of the mid-20th century. Companies like Camel and Used emotionally charged imagery to associate their products with masculinity, freedom, and rebellion. Cigarettes weren't just a product, they became a symbol of personal identity. The man, the rugged cowboy, became the epitome of strength and independence, playing on the emotional desires of men who sought to emulate that ideal. Women, too, were targeted with advertisements that linked beauty, success, and happiness with the consumption of specific products. But advertising didn't stop at selling products. It began selling lifestyles, identities, and entire worldviews. The emotional manipulation embedded in these ads was subtle, pervasive, and unrelenting. Brands tapped into the deepest recesses of human psychology, understanding that they could influence not only what people bought, but who they thought they were. The rise of psychology in the early 20th century further revolutionized the ways in which emotions could be manipulated. Figures like, and his nephew Edward, who would go on to be known as the father of public relations, used psychological insights to shape marketing strategies. For example, understood that the key to influencing people's emotions was not to tell them what to do, but to make them feel as if they were making the choice themselves. In his famous campaign for women's rights to smoke, he linked smoking to women's liberation and empowerment, effectively changing the cultural perception of cigarettes for an entire generation. Consumerism and the development of modern marketing as an emotional manipulation tool. In the modern world, emotional manipulation has become inextricably linked to consumerism. The rise of mass media, television, radio, and eventually the internet has provided an unprecedented platform for advertisers and corporations to reach and influence billions of people. Consumerism has created a culture in which people are made to feel incomplete, always seeking fulfillment through the next purchase, the next product, or the next experience. In today's world, emotional manipulation is omnipresent. Social media platforms, for example, are engineered to keep users engaged, emotionally invested, and constantly returning for more. Algorithms are designed not just to show you what you want to see, but to keep you hooked, amplifying your emotional reactions, whether those reactions are joy, anger, envy, or fear. The rise of influencers, the culture of likes and shares, the obsession with beauty and success, all of these are part of the ongoing emotional manipulation that has been embedded into modern life. Brands and corporations don't just sell products, they sell identities, lifestyles, and emotional fulfillment. And as the lines blur between reality and virtual reality, the stakes have never been higher. From kings to corporations, religious figures to social media influencers, the emotional manipulation of people has been a constant throughout history. But what happens when these tactics are used on a personal level, when manipulation isn't just a tool for societal control, but for controlling an individual's sense of self? In the next section, we'll delve into the psychological mechanisms behind emotional manipulation, exploring how these forces operate on an individual level, how they worm their way into the psyche and alter our perceptions of reality. Psychological mechanisms behind emotional manipulation. You're overreacting. You're too sensitive. That never happened. These phrases, simple, seemingly innocent, are some of the most dangerous words in the manipulator's arsenal. They don't just distort the truth, they warp reality itself, making the victim doubt their own perceptions, their own sanity. And in that doubt, the manipulator gains control. Emotional manipulation thrives on the inherent vulnerabilities of the human psyche. The mind is not always a rational machine. It's a complex web of emotions, beliefs, and cognitive shortcuts. In this section, we will explore the psychological mechanisms that make people, particularly those who are emotionally vulnerable, susceptible to manipulation. These mechanisms, cognitive biases, cognitive dissonance, gaslighting, and emotional dependency, are the mental tools that manipulators exploit to control and distort reality, all while remaining hidden in plain sight. Cognitive biases and cognitive dissonance, the mental shortcuts that lead to manipulation. Our brains, designed to help us navigate an overwhelmingly complex world, often rely on cognitive shortcuts, known as cognitive biases, to make quick decisions. These biases help us make sense of our environment and preserve our energy, but they can also lead us down dangerous paths, especially when it comes to emotional manipulation. One of the most common cognitive biases exploited in manipulation is the confirmation bias. This bias refers to the human tendency to seek out information that confirms our pre-existing beliefs, while ignoring evidence that contradicts them. Manipulators know that their targets often want to believe that everything is fine, that the relationship is healthy, or that their emotional needs are being met. So, when they subtly feed into that belief, sometimes through acts of kindness or occasional praise, the target's mind latches onto those moments, dismissing red flags or toxic behaviors. He only did that once, so it's not really a big deal. This line of thinking is precisely how confirmation bias keeps people trapped in manipulative relationships, unable to see the bigger picture. Another cognitive bias that plays a central role in manipulation is cognitive dissonance, the mental discomfort that arises when our beliefs or actions are in conflict with one another. In relationships, this manifests when a victim experiences a disconnect between how they feel about the manipulator and the manipulator's actions. For instance, a partner may claim to love and care for the victim, but their behavior contradicts this claim through emotional neglect or cruelty. The victim is left with a choice: either accept the discomfort of cognitive dissonance or change their perception to resolve the conflict. Most often, they choose the latter, adjusting their beliefs to fit the manipulator's narrative. For example, a woman might dismiss the manipulator's cruelty as just stress or a bad day, convincing herself that if she just tries harder or loves more deeply, the relationship will improve. In doing so, she rationalizes the manipulator's behavior, keeping herself locked in a cycle of self-doubt and confusion. The manipulator's control over her grows as she becomes unable to reconcile her internal discomfort with the reality of the manipulation. Gaslighting, the slow destruction of reality. If cognitive biases are the mental shortcuts that keep us trapped, gaslighting is the weapon that exploits them. Gaslighting is a form of psychological manipulation where the manipulator deliberately sows doubt in the victim's mind, making them question their memories, perceptions, and even their sanity. It's a slow, insidious process that erodes a person's sense of self, making them entirely dependent on the manipulator's version of reality. The term gaslighting originates from a play and subsequent film in the 1940s, where a husband manipulates his wife into doubting her own sanity by dimming the gas lights in their home and denying that anything has changed when she points it out. The husband's goal: to convince her that she is losing her grip on reality, making her more dependent on him for guidance and reassurance. In a modern relationship, gaslighting can take many forms. The manipulator might deny saying something hurtful, even if the victim clearly remembers it. They may accuse the victim of imagining things or being paranoid when they express concern about the relationship. Over time, the victim begins to doubt their own senses and judgments, making it easier for the manipulator to control the narrative. For instance, in an emotionally abusive romantic relationship, the manipulator may make the victim feel as though they're always too sensitive or overreacting, dismissing their feelings as unimportant. The victim, caught in the gaslighting cycle, starts to second-guess their own emotional responses, leading them to question whether their reactions are justified, all while the manipulator gains more control over the situation. Emotional dependency, the need for validation and the power of the manipulator. One of the most profound vulnerabilities that manipulators exploit is emotional dependency, the human need for validation, affection, and a sense of belonging. This dependency is not gender-specific. Both men and women experience it, but women, in particular, have historically been socialized to seek validation through relationships, caretaking, and emotional labor. Emotional dependency occurs when an individual's self-worth becomes heavily tied to the approval or affection of another person. When this need is unmet, feelings of worthlessness, anxiety, and loneliness can surface. Manipulators understand this vulnerability and use it as leverage. They offer praise, affection, or attention at just the right moments, feeding the victim's need for validation. This emotional reinforcement is what makes it so hard to break free from the manipulative cycle. Imagine a partner who showers their significant other with affection after moments of emotional cruelty. The sudden shift from neglect to love triggers intense emotional responses in the victim, making them crave more of the positive reinforcement. They begin to convince themselves that the manipulator loves them or that they can change, even though the evidence of manipulation is staring them in the face. This emotional dependency can also manifest in professional or familial settings, where the victim feels compelled to please the manipulator in order to earn their approval. The manipulator, seeing this dependency, tightens their grip, offering just enough positive reinforcement to keep the cycle of manipulation going. The victim remains caught in a loop of trying harder, feeling desperate for approval, and remaining emotionally bound to the manipulator. How these mechanisms enable manipulators to control their targets. These psychological mechanisms, cognitive biases, cognitive dissonance, gaslighting, and emotional dependency, work together in a highly effective and destructive way. They trap the victim in a constant state of confusion and self-doubt, eroding their sense of reality and their ability to trust themselves. By exploiting these vulnerabilities, manipulators can maintain control over their targets, manipulating their emotions and behaviors without ever needing to use overt force or threats. In romantic relationships, this dynamic is particularly dangerous. The victim's emotional needs are used against them, their self-worth becomes tangled in the manipulator's approval, and their perceptions of reality are constantly distorted. The manipulator, meanwhile, gains power not through brute force, but through the subtle, relentless manipulation of their target's emotions. But the most disturbing aspect of this manipulation is that it doesn't feel like manipulation to the victim. The manipulator doesn't always need to use harsh tactics. Sometimes, they merely have to create enough confusion, feed enough insecurity, and withhold enough affection to make the victim believe that they, and not the manipulator, are at fault. The result? A person who feels completely powerless, unable to break free from a cycle of emotional exploitation. We've seen how psychological mechanisms create the perfect breeding ground for emotional manipulation. But how does this play out in the real world? In the next section, we'll take a closer look at real-life examples of emotional manipulation, from toxic relationships to the manipulation seen in modern media and politics, showing how these tactics impact our everyday lives. Real-life examples of emotional manipulation. Imagine you're in a relationship where your partner is charming, loving, and seemingly everything you've ever wanted. But beneath the surface, something isn't quite right. They constantly criticize you, make you feel small, and often, just when you're at your lowest, they shower you with affection, only to pull it away again. This of emotion leaves you confused and trapped, not realizing that what's happening to you is manipulation, subtle, insidious, and powerful. In this section, we transition from the theoretical understanding of emotional manipulation to real-life applications. These case studies, drawn from toxic relationships, politics, social media, and corporate environments, illustrate how manipulation operates in various contexts. What's crucial to understand is that in each of these cases, the manipulated individuals often don't realize they're being controlled. Each case study provides a snapshot of how psychological tactics unfold in everyday life, creating a narrative of confusion, vulnerability, and power. Case Study 1: Toxic romantic relationships and the dynamics of control. Let's begin with a classic example of emotional manipulation in romantic relationships. Picture a woman in a relationship where her partner is, at first, seemingly the perfect match, charming, attentive, and kind. However, as time progresses, cracks begin to show. The partner begins to make subtle criticisms, undermining her self-esteem. He tells her that no one else would put up with her quirks or that she's too sensitive. Yet, when she begins to push back, he quickly showers her with affection, apologizing for his harsh words. She feels conflicted. Her gut tells her something is wrong, but the emotional highs and lows keep her hooked. This cycle of emotional abuse followed by love bombing is a textbook example of trauma bonding. It's the manipulation of the victim's emotional state to create dependence, where the highs of affection keep them coming back, while the lows reinforce the victim's sense of worthlessness. In the victim's mind, The manipulator is the only source of validation. As we discussed earlier, this dynamic thrives on emotional dependency and cognitive dissonance, as the victim tries to reconcile their feelings with the reality of the toxic behavior they are enduring. Case Study 2: Political Manipulation and the Influence of Propaganda. Emotional manipulation is not confined to the personal sphere, it permeates the political landscape as well. One of the most glaring examples of this is the manipulation of public opinion through propaganda. Political leaders, especially in times of crisis, use emotional manipulation to shape the narratives that control populations. A poignant example is the rise of authoritarian regimes in the 20th century, such as Nazi Germany under. His rise to power was heavily influenced by his ability to manipulate the collective emotions of the German people. By using fear, anger, and nationalism as emotional levers, he turned public discontent into a movement that justified atrocities. Propaganda posters, speeches, and mass rallies were designed not just to present ideas, but to evoke deep emotional responses, feelings of pride, anger, and fear directed at specific groups, such as Jews or communists, who were scapegoated as the cause of Germany's problems. What's insidious about this manipulation is how it exploits collective emotions like fear and identity. Propaganda works by hijacking cognitive biases like in-group favoritism, the tendency to favor one's own group, and out-group hostility, the tendency to view outsiders as enemies, manipulating the public into an us versus them mentality. The citizens, emotionally charged and terrified of losing their status, become complicit in the cycle of manipulation, leading to catastrophic consequences. Case Study 3: Social Media Influencers and the Power of Validation. In the 21st century, the rise of social media influencers has introduced a new dimension to emotional manipulation. These influencers wield enormous power over their followers by curating an idealized image of their lives. Social media platforms, such as Instagram, Tik, and YouTube, allow influencers to craft a persona that is designed to captivate and emotionally engage their audience. At first glance, these influencers might seem like they are simply sharing their experiences, but the truth is much more complex. They thrive on the emotional validation they receive from their followers. The like button, the comments, the shares, they all serve as immediate feedback that reinforces the influencer's sense of self-worth. But it's not just about them. The manipulation happens when they encourage their followers to seek the same external validation. For example, an influencer might post a picture with the caption, "I feel so confident today. Thanks to all of you for supporting me," subtly implying that her confidence and self-worth are tied to the validation she receives. Her followers, many of whom are struggling with their own sense of self, may begin to feel that their self-esteem, too, must come from external sources. The emotional dependency created by these influencers isn't always overt, but it's extremely effective. Followers are left chasing an ideal that is not only unrealistic, but emotionally exhausting. Case Study 4: Corporate Control Through Emotional Manipulation. The corporate world, too, is rife with emotional manipulation. The most powerful companies in the world understand that to sell a product, they must first sell an emotion. Whether it's the image of a perfect family, the promise of success, or the allure of luxury, corporations know that emotion drives purchasing decisions. But it goes beyond just selling a product. It's about creating emotional attachments to brands. Consider Apple, for example. The company has mastered the art of emotional branding. Apple doesn't just sell you a phone, it sells you an experience, a lifestyle, and identity. The sleek design of the product, the minimalist aesthetic, and the way Apple positions itself as a rebellious brand that challenges the establishment all play on deep emotional triggers. By aligning themselves with values of innovation, creativity, and freedom, Apple creates an emotional bond with its customers, making them feel as if owning an Apple product is not just a choice, but a statement of who they are. This emotional manipulation is often subtle, operating through advertisements, social proof, seeing others with Apple products, and a sense of exclusivity. The result: consumers become emotionally invested in the brand, and their purchases are no longer driven purely by utility, but by a deep emotional connection that can be exploited by the corporation. In many ways, these companies manipulate not just our wallets, but our identities and emotions. From toxic relationships to political propaganda, from social media influencers to corporate branding, emotional manipulation is woven into the very fabric of our lives. It's subtle, it's pervasive, and it's often invisible to those who fall victim to it. But the question remains: how can we recognize these manipulations, and more importantly, how can we break free from them? In the next section, we'll explore the psychological tools and strategies that can help us protect ourselves from emotional manipulation and take back control of our lives and relationships. How emotional manipulation affects women differently. From a young age, girls are often taught to be nurturing, to be emotionally attuned to the needs of others, and to maintain harmonious relationships. They are praised for being good listeners, caregivers, and empathetic. These qualities, values that are often idealized in women, are not inherently negative. However, they also create an environment where women are more vulnerable to emotional manipulation. For women, emotional manipulation doesn't just happen in romantic relationships. It is deeply embedded in societal expectations, historical gender roles, and cultural narratives. In this section, we'll explore why women are, perhaps, more susceptible to emotional manipulation than men. Drawing from feminist psychology, cultural analysis, and historical context, we will examine the gendered dimensions of emotional manipulation. By understanding the societal structures that shape women's lives, we can better see how these structures leave women particularly vulnerable to exploitation by manipulative forces. Gender roles and emotional manipulation: why women are targeted more. Women, historically and psychologically, have been socialized into gender roles that emphasize emotional intelligence, relational care, and the importance of nurturing others. These roles are deeply ingrained in how women are raised, what society expects from them, and how they view their own worth. Women are often taught that their value lies in how well they manage relationships and care for others, whether that's as a daughter, a wife, a mother, or a friend. This emotional labor, constantly being attuned to the needs of others, managing emotional climates, and smoothing over conflicts, places women in a position where they are emotionally available, perhaps more so than men. Manipulators, whether in personal, professional, or social contexts, understand this vulnerability and take advantage of it. Women's emotional sensitivity and tendency to care for others make them prime targets for manipulation, as they often prioritize the emotional well-being of others over their own. In romantic relationships, this dynamic plays out in the form of emotional blackmail or gaslighting, where women feel responsible for maintaining peace and resolving conflict, even at the expense of their own needs. The societal expectation that women should fix things and prioritize others' feelings makes them more susceptible to emotional exploitation. This is compounded by the idea that a woman's worth is tied to her ability to nurture and care for others, which is often distorted by manipulators. Societal expectations and the role of emotional labor. The undervaluation of women's emotional labor is another crucial factor in why they are more susceptible to emotional manipulation. Emotional labor refers to the work of managing one's emotions and the emotions of others, something that women often do in both public and private spheres. Women are expected to perform this emotional labor without compensation or recognition, which makes it even easier for others to take advantage of them. The cultural narrative that women are naturally more empathetic and emotionally capable positions them as the primary emotional caretakers, which makes them vulnerable to those who would seek to exploit that. The manipulation often goes unnoticed or is dismissed because emotional labor is considered natural for women. Society doesn't recognize the toll this labor takes on women's mental health, and as a result, their emotional boundaries are often blurred or ignored. In work environments, for instance, women may be expected to mediate conflicts or manage the emotional atmosphere of the office, even when it is not their responsibility. In relationships, women are frequently cast in the role of emotional support, leading them to shoulder the emotional burdens of their partners or family members. In both cases, the emotional labor they perform is rarely acknowledged or appreciated, creating an environment where it's easy for manipulators to take advantage of this constant availability. Emotional manipulation often goes unnoticed or is dismissed when women are the victims. Emotional manipulation of women often goes unnoticed or is dismissed because it is so deeply woven into the fabric of societal expectations. When a woman expresses distress in a relationship or work environment, the response is often one of sympathy or concern, but rarely of action. When women are manipulated, their distress is often minimized with comments like, "You're being too sensitive," or "It's just how he is." This dismissal can leave women doubting their own feelings and perceptions, further perpetuating the cycle of emotional manipulation. Women's emotional responses are frequently trivialized, both in personal and public spheres. This not only undermines the severity of the manipulation they are experiencing, but also discourages them from speaking up about it. When women do try to assert themselves or draw attention to manipulation, they are often labeled as difficult or too emotional, leading to further isolation and self-doubt. Women's self-worth tied to relationships, leading to vulnerability. Another reason why women are particularly vulnerable to emotional manipulation is because of the way their self-worth is often tied to their relationships. From a young age, women are socialized to find value in being loved, cared for, and desired. In contrast, men are more often taught to find self-worth in personal achievement and independence. The romanticized ideal of finding the one, or being in a relationship as a validation of personal worth, is a powerful cultural force. This societal pressure can make women feel that their value is contingent on their ability to maintain relationships, often leading them to endure unhealthy dynamics for fear of being alone or unworthy. In the context of a manipulative relationship, this sense of dependency on the validation of others can trap women in cycles of emotional abuse, as they convince themselves that staying in the relationship is necessary for their happiness and sense of self. This is compounded by the tendency to measure their emotional worth through their partner's behavior. If a partner withholds affection, criticizes, or manipulates, a woman might internalize these actions as reflections of her own inadequacy. The more deeply women tie their identity to the approval of others, especially in romantic contexts, the more likely they are to endure toxic emotional dynamics in the hope of restoring that approval. While women may be particularly vulnerable to emotional manipulation, the dynamics of power, control, and self-worth affect everyone. So, how can individuals recognize the subtle signs of emotional manipulation and break free from these cycles? In the next section, we'll explore strategies for reclaiming self-worth and setting boundaries, enabling people to protect themselves from emotional exploitation. Breaking free: how to recognize and resist emotional manipulation. Recognizing that you're being emotionally manipulated can be one of the hardest realizations to come to. It's often followed by a rush of guilt, confusion, and even self-blame. But once you can identify the manipulation, you can take the necessary steps to reclaim your emotional autonomy and rebuild your sense of self-worth. In this section, we'll explore practical tools and strategies to help you break free from the grips of emotional manipulation and protect yourself moving forward. How to recognize the signs of emotional manipulation. The first step in resisting emotional manipulation is recognizing the signs. Emotional manipulators often operate in subtle ways, making their actions difficult to detect until it's too late. However, there are common red flags to watch for. Gaslighting. If someone constantly makes you doubt your perceptions, memories, or feelings, this is a key sign of manipulation. Excessive guilt tripping. Manipulators will often make you feel guilty for expressing your needs, desires, or emotions. Love bombing and withdrawal. The sudden shifts between excessive affection and emotional withdrawal are a tactic used to keep you off balance and dependent. Blaming you for their emotions or actions. Manipulators will frequently place responsibility for their behavior on you, making you feel at fault for their unhappiness or actions. Being aware of these patterns is the first step toward breaking free. If you notice any of these behaviors in your relationships, it's crucial to take a step back and assess whether the relationship is healthy or manipulative. Building emotional independence and self-awareness. Emotional independence is essential in resisting manipulation. The more you rely on others for validation or emotional stability, the more vulnerable you are to emotional exploitation. To build emotional independence, develop self-awareness. Spend time reflecting on your own values, needs, and desires. Understand that your worth is not determined by anyone else's approval. Reclaim your autonomy. Practice making decisions for yourself, independent of what others expect or want from you. Cultivate self-compassion. Treat yourself with kindness, recognizing that your feelings are valid, even when they conflict with someone else's desires or expectations. The more you connect with your own sense of self-worth, the less power a manipulator has over you. Cultivating healthy boundaries and self-worth. Setting healthy boundaries is one of the most powerful ways to protect yourself from emotional manipulation. Boundaries communicate what is and isn't acceptable behavior from others. To cultivate strong boundaries, know your limits. Understand what you are and are not willing to tolerate in relationships. Communicate assertively. Be clear and firm when expressing your needs and setting boundaries with others. You have the right to protect your emotional well-being. Don't feel guilty. Remember, setting boundaries isn't selfish. It's essential for your mental and emotional health. As you strengthen your sense of self-worth and reinforce your boundaries, emotional manipulators will find it much more difficult to maintain their control. Overcoming guilt and confusion when recognizing manipulation. One of the most difficult aspects of recognizing emotional manipulation is the guilt and confusion that often follow. You may feel like you're overreacting or that you're the one to blame for the toxic dynamic. However, it's important to remember that your feelings are valid. If something feels wrong, it likely is. Trust your instincts and don't let anyone convince you otherwise. Guilt is often a manipulation tactic. Manipulators use guilt to keep you in the relationship, so when you feel guilty for setting boundaries, ask yourself, who is this guilt serving? Take it one step at a time. It's okay to take small, gradual steps toward detaching yourself from a manipulative relationship. The process of healing and rebuilding your self-worth takes time, but every step forward is a victory. By recognizing manipulation for what it is, you can begin to free yourself from its grip, rebuild your emotional strength, and live more authentically and independently. Breaking free from emotional manipulation is a process of self-discovery and reclaiming your power. But the work doesn't stop once you recognize the manipulation. You must continue to cultivate self-awareness, establish healthy relationships, and above all, trust in your own ability to define your worth. In the final section, we'll discuss the ongoing journey of maintaining emotional freedom and protecting yourself from manipulation in the future. The power of awareness and the road to freedom. Awareness is the first step toward liberation. As we've journeyed through the complexities of emotional manipulation, it becomes clear that the true power lies not in resistance to external forces, but in our ability to recognize them and make conscious choices. The tools of emotional manipulation, whether through gaslighting, guilt-tripping, or subtle coercion, thrive in the shadows of ignorance. But when we bring these tactics into the light of self-awareness, their power begins to dissipate. Throughout this documentary, we've explored how emotional manipulation operates on a psychological level, how it plays out in real-life scenarios, and why certain individuals, particularly women, are more vulnerable. We've learned that manipulation is not an isolated incident, but a pervasive force that seeps into relationships, politics, and society at large. But here's the crucial truth. We don't have to be passive recipients of this manipulation. The power of awareness gives us the ability to see through the veil and reclaim our agency. By understanding emotional manipulation through a philosophical and psychological lens, whether through the existential insights of or the psychological mechanisms that underlie human behavior, we see that we are not helpless pawns. Instead, we are empowered individuals capable of reclaiming our autonomy. It is only when we become aware of the forces that influence us, those that shape our decisions, our actions, and even our relationships, that we can begin to break free from their grasp. The most profound realization is that choice is at the heart of freedom. Emotional manipulation only holds power when we are unaware of our choices, when we believe that we are subject to the whims and desires of others. But once we recognize that we have the agency to choose how we react, whom we trust, and how we define our self-worth, we move from victim to victor. We are no longer bound by the invisible chains of manipulation. At the core of this journey is authenticity, the courage to stand in our truth, to trust ourselves, and to act in accordance with our values, rather than the expectations or manipulations of others. To live authentically is to resist the pull of external forces that seek to shape us into someone we are not. It's a reminder that our worth is not contingent on the approval of others, but on our own understanding of who we are. So, as we reflect on the lessons from this exploration of emotional manipulation, let us remember that the road to freedom starts with awareness. It begins by questioning the subtle forces that shape our decisions and actions, and choosing, instead, to live a life true to ourselves, empowered, autonomous, and free. The choice is yours.